Lord of the Flies. Chapter 1. The Sound of the Shell. The boy with fair hair lowered himself down the last few feet of rock and began to pick his way toward the lagoon. Though he had taken off his school sweater, his gray shirt stuck to him and his hair was plastered to his forehead. All round him, the jungle was a bath of heat. He was clambering heavily among the creepers and broken trunks when a bird, a vision of red and yellow, flashed upwards with a witch-like cry, and this cry was echoed by another. "Hi," it said. "Wait a minute." The undergrowth at the side of the scar was shaken and a multitude of raindrops fell pattering. "Wait a minute," the voice said. "I got caught up." The fair boy stopped and jerked his stockings with an automatic gesture that made the jungle seem for a moment like the home counties. The voice spoke again. "I can't hardly move with all these creeper things." The owner of the voice came backing out of the undergrowth so that twigs scratched on a greasy windbreaker. The naked crooks of his knees were plump, caught and scratched by thorns. He was shorter than the fair boy and very fat. "Where's the man with the megaphone?" The fair boy shook his head. "This is an island. At least I think it's an island. That's a reef out in the sea. Perhaps there aren't any grown-ups anywhere." The fat boy looked startled. There was that pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger cabin, he was up in front. "All them other kids," the fat boy went on. "Some of them must have got out. They must have, mustn't they? Aren't there any grown-ups at all?" "I don't think so." The fair boy said this solemnly, but then the delight of a realized ambition overcame him. In the middle of the scar, he stood on his head and grinned at the reversed fat boy. "No grown-ups. We was attacked. The pilot will be back all right." The fat boy shook his head. "When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows. I saw the other. Part of the plane. There were flames coming out of it." He looked up and down the scar. "And this is what the cabin done." The fair boy reached out and touched the jagged end of a trunk. For a moment he looked interested. "What happened to it?" he asked. "Where's it got to now? That storm dragged it out to sea. It wasn't half dangerous with all them tree trunks." "Falling. There must have been some kids still in it." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "What's your name?" "Ralph." The fat boy waited to be asked his name in turn, but this proffer of acquaintance was not made. The fair boy, called Ralph, smiled vaguely, stood up, and began to make his way once more toward the lagoon. The fat boy hung steadily at his shoulder. "I expect there's a lot more of us scattered about. You haven't seen any others, have you?" Ralph shook his head and increased his speed. Then he tripped over a branch and came down with a crash. The fat boy stood by him, breathing hard. "My auntie told me not to run," he explained, "on account of my asthma." "Asthma? That's right. Can't catch my breath. I was the only boy in our school what had asthma," said the fat boy with a touch of pride. "And I've been wearing specs since I was 3. He took off his glasses and held them out to Ralph, blinking and smiling, and then started to wipe them against his grubby windbreaker. An expression of pain and inward concentration altered the pale contours of his face. He smeared the sweat from his cheeks and quickly adjusted the spectacles on his nose. "Them fruit." He glanced round the scar. "Them fruit," he said. "I expect." He put on his glasses, waded away from Ralph, and crouched down among the tangled foliage. "I'll be out again in just a minute." Ralph disentangled himself cautiously and stole away through the branches. In a few seconds, the fat boy's grunts were behind him, and he was hurrying toward the screen that still lay between him and the lagoon. He climbed over a broken trunk and was out of the jungle. The shore was fledged with palm trees. The ground beneath them was a bank covered with coarse grass, torn everywhere by the upheavals of fallen trees, scattered with decaying coconuts and palm saplings. Behind this was the darkness of the forest proper and the open space of the scar. Ralph stood, one hand against a gray trunk, and screwed up his eyes against the shimmering water. Out there, perhaps a mile away, the white surf flinked on a coral reef, and beyond that the open sea was dark blue. Within the irregular arc of coral, the lagoon was still as a mountain lake blue of all shades and shadowy green and purple. The beach between the palm terrace and the water was a thin stick, endless apparently, for to Ralph's left the perspectives of palm and beach and water drew to a point at infinity, and always, almost visible, was the heat. He jumped down from the terrace. The sand was thick over his black shoes and the heat hit him. He became conscious of the weight of clothes, kicked his shoes off fiercely, and ripped off each stocking with its elastic garter in a single movement. He undid the snake clasp of his belt, lugged off his shorts and pants, and stood there naked, looking at the dazzling beach and the water. He was old enough, 12 years and a few months, to have lost the prominent tummy of childhood and not yet old enough for adolescence to have made him awkward. He patted the palm trunks softly and, forced at last to believe in the reality of the island, laughed delightedly again and stood on his head. He turned neatly onto his feet, jumped down to the beach, knelt and swept a double armful of sand into a pile against his chest. Then he sat back and looked at the water, with bright, excited eyes. "Ralph!" The fat boy lowered himself over the terrace and sat down carefully, using the edge as a seat. "I'm sorry I've been such a time. Them fruit. I expect we'll want to know all their names," said the fat boy, "and make a list. We ought to have a meeting." Ralph did not take the hint, so the fat boy was forced to continue. "I don't care what they call me," he said confidentially, "so long as they don't call me what they used to call me at school." Ralph was faintly interested. "What was that?" The fat boy glanced over his shoulder, then leaned toward Ralph. He whispered, "They used to call me Piggy." Ralph shrieked with laughter. He jumped up. "Piggy, Piggy, Ralph, please." Piggy clasped his hands in apprehension. "I said I didn't want— Piggy! Piggy!" He dived in the sand at Piggy's feet and lay there laughing. "Piggy!" Piggy grinned reluctantly, pleased despite himself at even this much recognition. "So long as you don't tell the others." Beyond the platform there was more enchantment. Some act of God, a typhoon perhaps, or the storm that had accompanied his own arrival, had banked sand inside the lagoon so that there was a long, deep pool in the beach with a high ledge of pink granite at the further end. Ralph had been deceived before now by the specious appearance of depth in a beach pool, and he approached this one preparing to be disappointed. But the island ran true to form, and the incredible pool, which clearly was only invaded by the sea at high tide, was so deep at one end as to be dark green. Ralph inspected the whole 30 yards carefully and then plunged in. The water was warmer than his blood, and he might have been swimming in a huge bath. "Aren't you going to swim?" Piggy shook his head. "I can't swim. I wasn't allowed. My asthma—" "Sucks to your ass, Mar." Piggy bore this with the sort of humble patience. "You can't half swim well." Ralph paddled backwards down the slope, immersed his mouth and blew a jet of water into the air. Then he lifted his chin and spoke. "I could swim when I was 5. Daddy taught me. He's a commander in the Navy. When he gets leave, he'll come and rescue us." "What's— your father?" Piggy flushed suddenly. "My dad's dead," he said quickly, "and my mom— I used to live with my auntie. She kept a candy store. I used to get ever so many candies. As many as I liked." "When'll your dad rescue us?" "Soon as he can." "How does he know we're here?" Ralph lolled in the water. Sleep enveloped him like the swathing mirages that were wrestling with the brilliance of the lagoon. "How does he know we're here?" "Because," thought Ralph. Because. The roar from the reef became very distant. "They'd tell him at the airport." Piggy shook his head, put on his flashing glasses and looked down at Ralph. "Not them. Didn't you hear what the pilot said about the atom bomb? They're all dead." "This an island, isn't it?" "I climbed a rock," said Ralph slowly, "and I think this is an island." "They're all dead," said Piggy, "and this is an island. Nobody don't know we're here. Your dad don't know. Nobody don't know." His lips quivered, and the spectacles were dimmed with mist. "We may stay here till we die. We got to find the others. We got to do something." Ralph said nothing. Here was a coral island. Protected from the sun, ignoring Piggy's ill-omened talk, he dreamed pleasantly. Piggy insisted. "How many of us are there?" "I don't know. We got to do something." Ralph looked through him. Here at last was the imagined but never fully realized place, leaping into real life. Ralph's lips parted in a delighted smile, and Piggy, taking this smile to himself as a mark of recognition, laughed with pleasure. "What's that?" Ralph had stopped smiling and was pointing into the lagoon. Something creamy lay among the ferny weeds. A stone. No, a shell. Suddenly Piggy was a bubble with decorous excitement. "'S right, it's a shell. He kind of spat," said Piggy. "My auntie wouldn't let me blow on account of my asthma. He said you blew from down here." Piggy laid a hand on his jutting abdomen. "You try, Ralph. You'll call the others." Doubtfully, Ralph laid the small end of the shell against his mouth and blew. There came a rushing sound from its mouth, but nothing more. Ralph wiped the salt water off his lips and tried again, but the shell remained silent. He blew from down here. Ralph grasped the idea and hit the shell with air from his diaphragm. Immediately the thing sounded. A deep, harsh note boomed under the palms, spread through the intricacies of the forest and echoed back from the pink granite of the mountain. Ralph took the shell away from his lips. "Gosh!" His ordinary voice sounded like a whisper after the harsh note of the conch. He laid the conch against his lips, took a deep breath and blew once more. The note boomed again. "I bet you can hear that for miles." Ralph found his breath and blew a series of short blasts. Piggy exclaimed, "There's one!" Signs of life were visible now on the beach. The sand, trembling beneath the heat haze, concealed many figures in its miles of length. Boys were making their way toward the platform through the hot sand. 3 small children appeared. A dark little boy, not much younger than Piggy, parted a tangle of undergrowth, walked onto the platform, and smiled cheerfully at everybody. More and more of them came. They sat down on the fallen palm trunks and waited. Ralph continued to blow short, penetrating blasts. The children who came along the beach, singly or in twos, leapt into visibility when they crossed the line from heat haze to nearer sand. Even while he blew, Ralph noticed the last pair of bodies that reached the platform above a fluttering patch of black. The 2 boys, bullet-headed and with hair like tow, flung themselves down and lay grinning and panting at Ralph like dogs. They were twins, and the eye was shocked and incredulous at such cheery duplication. Piggy bent his flashing glasses to them and could be heard between the blasts, repeating their names. Sam, Eric, Sam, Eric. At last, Ralph ceased to blow and sat there, the conch trailing from one hand, his head bowed on his knees. As the echoes died away, so did the laughter, and there was silence. Within the diamond haze of the beach, something dark was fumbling along. Ralph saw it first, and watched till the intentness of his gaze drew all eyes that way. Then the creature stepped from mirage onto clear sand, and they saw that the darkness was not all shadow but mostly clothing. The creature was a party of boys, marching approximately in step in 2. Parallel lines and dressed in strangely eccentric clothing. Each boy wore a square black cap with a silver badge on it. Their bodies, from throat to ankle, were hidden by black cloaks which bore a long silver cross on the left breast, and each neck was finished off with a ham-bone frill. The boy who controlled them was dressed in the same way, though his cap badge was golden. When his party was about 10 yards from the platform, he shouted an order, and they halted, gasping, sweating, swaying in the fierce light. The boy himself came forward, vaulted onto the platform with his cloak flying, and peered into what to him was almost complete darkness. "Where's the man with the trumpet?" Ralph, sensing his sunblindness, answered him. "There's no man with a trumpet, only me." Inside the floating cloak he was tall, thin, and bony, and his hair was red beneath the black cap. His face was crumpled and freckled, and ugly without silliness. Out of his face stared 2 light blue eyes, frustrated now and turning, or ready to turn, to anger. "Isn't there a man here?" Ralph spoke to his back. "No, we're having a meeting. Come and join in." The group of cloaked boys began to scatter from close line. The tall boy shouted at them, "Choir, stand still!" Wearily obedient, the choir huddled into line and stood there swaying in the sun. None. The less, some began to protest faintly. "Aren't there any grown-ups?" "No." Meridew sat down on a trunk and looked round the circle. "Then we'll have to look after ourselves." Secure on the other side of Ralph, Piggy spoke timidly. "That's why Ralph made a meeting, so as we can decide what to do." "We'd better all have names," said Ralph, "so I'm Ralph." "We got Mo's names," said Piggy. "Got 'em just now." "Kids' names," said Meridew. "Why should I be Jack? I'm a Meridew." Ralph turned to him quickly. This was the voice of one who knew his own mind. "Then," went on Piggy, "that boy I forget." "You're talking too much," said Jack Meridew. "Shut up, fatty." Laughter arose. "He's not fatty," cried Ralph. "His real name's Piggy." "Piggy, oh Piggy." A storm of laughter arose, and even the tiniest child joined in. For the moment the boys were a closed circuit of sympathy with Piggy outside. He went very pink, bowed his head, and cleaned his glasses again. Finally the laughter died away, and the naming continued. There was Maurice, next in size among the choir boys to Jack, but broad and grinning all the time. There was a slight, furtive boy whom no one knew, who kept to himself with an inner intensity of avoidance and secrecy. He muttered that his name was Roger and was silent again. Bill, Robert, Harold, Henry, the choir boy who had fainted, sat up against a palm trunk, smiled pallidly at Ralph and said that his name was Simon. Jack spoke. "We've got to decide about being rescued." There was a buzz. One of the small boys, Henry, said that he wanted to go home. "Shut up," said Ralph absently. He lifted the conch. "Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things." "A chief, a chief." "I ought to be chief," said Jack with simple arrogance, "because I'm chapter chorister and head boy. I can sing C sharp." Another buzz. "Well then," said Jack, He hesitated. The dark boy, Roger, stirred at last and spoke up. "Let's have a vote." "Yais, vote for chief." "Let's vote." This toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. Jack started to protest, but the clamor changed from the general wish for a chief to an election by a claim of Ralph himself. None of the boys could have found good reason for this. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy, while the most obvious leader was Jack. But there was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size and attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the conch. Him with the shell. "Ralph, Ralph, let him be chief with the trumpet thing." Ralph raised a hand for silence. All right, who wants Jack for chief? With dreary obedience, the choir raised their hands. Who wants me? Every hand outside the choir except Piggy's was raised immediately. Then Piggy, too, raised his hand grudgingly into the air. Ralph counted. I'm chief then. The circle of boys broke into applause. Even the choir applauded, and the freckles on Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. He started up, then changed his mind and sat down again while the air rang. Ralph looked at him, eager to offer something. The choir belongs to you, of course. They could be the army, or hunters. They can be what you want them to be. Hunters. Jack and Ralph smiled at each other with shy liking. The rest began to talk eagerly. Jack stood up. All right, choir, take off your togs. As if released from class, the choir boys stood up, chattered, piled their black cloaks on. The grass. I tried to get over that hill to see if there was water all round. But your shell called us. Ralph smiled and held up the conch for silence. Listen, everybody. I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do, straight off. Everybody must stay around here and wait and not go away. 3 of us, if we take more, we get all mixed and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go, and Jack, and. He looked round the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from. And Simon. The boys round Simon giggled and he stood up, laughing a little. Now that the pallor of his faint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy, with a glance coming up from under a hut of straight hair that hung down, black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. I'll come. And Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouded it into a trunk. The buzz rose and died away. Piggy stirred. I'll come. Ralph turned to him. You're no good on a job like this. All the same. We don't want you, said Jack flatly. 3's enough. Piggy's glasses flashed. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand past the bathing pool. Piggy hung bumbling behind them. Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. You told him, after what I said. What on earth are you talking about? About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care, as long as they didn't call me Piggy, and I said not to tell, and then you went and said straight out. Stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the 2 courses of apology or further insult. Better Piggy than Fatty, he said at last, with the directness of genuine leadership. And anyway, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long. He turned and raced after the other 2. Piggy stood, and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. Come on, said Jack presently. We're explorers. We'll go to the end of the island, said Ralph, and look round the corner. Now, toward the end of the afternoon, the mirages were settling a little. They found the end of the island. We shan't see round this corner, said Jack, because there isn't one. Only a slow curve, and you can see the rocks get worse. Ralph shaded his eyes and followed the jagged outline of the crags up toward the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any other that they had seen. We'll try climbing the mountain from here, he said. I should think this is the easiest way. There's less of that jungly stuff and more pink rock. Come on. The 3 boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shattered these cubes so that they lay askew, often piled diminishingly on each other. The most usual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by a skewed block, and that again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a stack of balanced rock projecting through the looped fantasy of the forest creepers. Where the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upwards. They could edge along them, deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. What made this track? Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his face. Ralph stood by him, breathless. Men? Jack shook his head. Animals? Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees. The forest minutely vibrated. Come on. The difficulty was not the steep ascent round the shoulders of rock, but the occasional plunges through the undergrowth to get to the next path. This is real exploring, said Jack. I bet nobody's been here before. The pink granite of the next cliff was further back from the creepers and trees so that they could trot up the path. This again led into more open forest so that they had a glimpse of the spread sea. Look! Look! High over this end of the island, the shattered rocks lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, against which Jack leaned, moved with a grating sound when they pushed. Come on, but not come on to the top. The assault on the summit must wait while the 3 boys accepted this challenge. The rock was as large as a small motor car. Heave! Sway back and forth, catch the rhythm. Heave! Increase the swing of the pendulum. Increase, increase. Come up and bear against that point of furthest balance. Increase, increase. Heave! The great rock loitered, poised on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leapt droning through the air, and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Echoes and birds flew, white and pink dust floated. The forest further down shook as with the passage of an enraged monster, and then the island was still. Wacko. Like a bomb. The way to the top was easy after that. As they reached the last stretch, Ralph stopped. They had guessed before that this was an island, clambering among the pink rocks, with the sea on either side, and the crystal heights of air. They had known by some instinct that the sea lay on every side. But there seemed something more fitting in leaving the last word till they stood on the top, and could see a circular horizon of water. Ralph turned to the others. "This belongs to us." The boys surveyed all this, then looked out to sea. Jack pointed down. "That's where we landed." Beyond falls and cliffs, there was a gash visible in the trees. There were the splintered trunks, and then the drag, leaving only a fringe of palm between the scar and the sea. There too, jutting into the lagoon, was the platform, with insect-like figures moving near it. "Come on," said Ralph. "We found out what we wanted to know." They scrambled down a rock slope. They were in the beginnings of the thick forest, plonking with weary feet on a track, when they heard the noises, squeakings, and the hard strike of hoofs on a path. As they pushed forward, the squeaking increased till it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in a curtain of creepers, throwing itself at the elastic traces in all the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needle-sharp, and insistent. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife again with a flourish. He raised his arm in the air. There came a pause, a hiatus. The pig continued to scream and the creepers to jerk, and the blade continued to flash at the end of a bony arm. The pause was only long enough for them to understand what an enormity the downward stroke would be. Then the piglet tore loose from the creepers and scurried into the undergrowth. They were left looking at each other, and the place of terror. Jack's face was white under the freckles. He noticed that he still held the knife aloft and brought his arm down, replacing the blade in the sheath. Then they all three laughed ashamedly and began to climb back to the track. "I was choosing a place," said Jack. "I was just waiting for a moment to decide where to stab him." "You should stick a pig," said Ralph fiercely. "They always talk about sticking a pig." "You cut a pig's throat to let the blood out," said Jack. "Otherwise you can't eat the meat." "Why didn't you?" They knew very well why he hadn't, because of the enormity of the knife descending and cutting into living flesh, because of the unbearable blood. "I was going to," said Jack. He was ahead of them, and they could not see his face. "I was choosing a place. Next time."